Thank you so much for coming. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to the Tao Center for Digital Journalists, for digital journalism, for bringing a great group of folks together to talk about community-centered journalism. My name is Andrea Wenzel. I'm an assistant professor at Temple University and a fellow with the Tao Center. And I'm extremely grateful for the panelists that we have here today. Sarah Alvarez, founder and executive editor of Outlier Media, Alicia Bell, Free Press News Voices organizing manager, and Jessica Maria Ross, senior community engagement strategist at Capital Public Radio. So hello, everybody. It's so nice to see your faces. And we're going to hear a lot more from them in just a minute. But first, I'm going to try to set the scene of our discussion with everyone and try to compress the book that I wrote into about 10 minutes. We'll see how that goes, more or less. So I think you can probably see my screen now, hopefully. If not, please someone tell me. So I'm gonna start actually by sharing what this book is not about. So this book is not about saving the journalism industry. It's a book about reimagining how journalism could better serve communities. And what that looks like may bear a little resemblance to traditional ideas of journalism. Uh-oh, can't see my screen.
Right.
All right, let me see here. Let me try that again. Thank you all.
Hi, Samantha McCann from Journalism. And while we're waiting, yeah, anybody who wants to drop a hello in the chat, let us know.
Yeah, it's kind of weird not being able to see you, so please drop a hello in the chat. Also, if you have questions throughout this, if you want to share it in the chat, that would be great. So can you see my screen now? Yeah. Awesome. Okay, great. So that's who we all are. It's also in the chat. I've put everybody's names and Twitter handles. So anyhow, yes, so here I am. We're going to try that again. So as I mentioned, this book, it's not so much about saving the journalism industry as it is about reimagining what journalism could be and how it could better serve communities. And so I'm interested in looking at the process of community-centered journalism and how it could repair journalism. And along the way, I hope that can be used to address some of the harms that journalism has caused over the years, including problems around trust. But my starting point now is not to how to improve the industry as much as how to try to improve the communication health of communities. So why did I write this book? So before I went back for my PhD, I worked for 15 years in public media and international media development. And when I was doing that, I would experiment with projects that we now might call solutions journalism or engaged journalism, or at least kind of edging up against those concepts. And then when I went back for my PhD, I realized, oh, these things have names. There's a lot of concepts and people who have been working on these for years. And so traditions like peace journalism, public journalism are out there. And at that time, there was a new group starting out called the Solutions Journalism Network, which many of you may have heard of by now. And they put forward this idea that a journalist's role isn't only to report on problems, but to rigorously report on responses to social problems. And I recommend looking at their website for a lot more resources on solutions journalism. A bit later on, I started hearing the term engaged journalism. And this term is a little more slippery because people can use engagement to mean a lot of different things. I find this definition by Lindsay Green Barber to be really helpful. But basically, I think engaged journalism, I think of it as a range of practices that aim to build relationships between journalists and publics and involve the public in the journalistic process. If you want to learn more about engaged journalism, plug for the Gather platform on the website, you might want to check that out. So I wanted to understand what happens when you combine solutions journalism with engaged journalism. And sorry, I'm a sucker for food things. So I argue that they are the peanut butter and jelly of journalism. So each can be delicious on their own, but they're so much more delicious when they're combined. And so what would happen if you combine these? And not just in an abstract way, but in the context of places. So what would it look like for journalism to try and build trust with communities by using engaged journalism and solutions journalism in places? So I won't go all wonky with the academic theory, just spare me 1 second here with it. But communication infrastructure theory tries to address the communication health of communities. So it can be used to, assess the health and then to design and evaluate interventions. Basically, the concept is that all communities have different actors who are involved in telling a community's story. So you have local media, but you also have community groups and you have residents. And when the relationships between these different actors are strong, then you tend to have a common understanding of what the issues in a community are and what you can do about them. But these links can be weakened, say if the community is divided along lines of ethnicity or language, or when stories circulating in the network are exclusively negative. So I wanted to understand whether introducing solutions journalism, engaged journalism could affect the storytelling network. And I was particularly interested in communities that have been marginalized and have a history of negative news coverage. So one of the book's big questions is this. So can interventions that use solutions journalism and engaged journalism build trust and strengthen communication in communities? So throughout the book, I look at, throughout the book, I look at a series of case studies that look at different links in local storytelling networks. I started out in South LA, majority Black and Latinx community, where I worked with colleagues to organize workshops where we brought together local organizations and media. These led to a series of solutions journalism stories. We then held focus groups with residents about the stories. And people were really enthusiastic about the concept of solutions journalism, but they had concerns about who gets to tell the stories. And they wanted communities to be more involved in that process. So this intervention did do some work to strengthen ties between community groups and local media, and solutions journalism showed promise for contributing to a more positive narrative circulating about South LA. But without engagement, residents wouldn't find out about those stories, they wouldn't know about them. And so the next case that I ended up looking at was a newsroom that was trying to involve community members in the process of making journalism. A lot of you probably have heard of Hearken. It's a tool that lets newsrooms invite audiences to ask questions and then vote on what they want reported. Curious City is the original project where Hearken started in Chicago. And a few years back, they looked at where questions were coming from, and they noticed they were not hearing very much from majority African-American Latinx communities on the South and West sides. So they wanted to expand who they got questions from, and so they designed an experiment to try different outreach approaches. They found the most effective method was when they did face-to-face outreach, but they collaborated with partners. So in particular, they had a lot of success working with libraries. And even this, though, had some limitations. So they didn't really do any marketing at the time. And so, people wouldn't have a way of knowing how to follow up or how to give feedback. So in this case, the process, the intervention did strengthen the link between media and residents, but it wasn't necessarily a two-way relationship. So after observing these projects, I wanted to see what a model might be for giving communities more power to be involved in the process of making and sharing narratives about and making these Western Kentucky, and we tested out a model for a research-based local journalism intervention. We focused on a majority white, majority Republican area in Western Kentucky, and we looked at how political polarization was affecting the local storytelling networks there. We did focus groups, diaries, and interviews. The short version of what we found was that political polarization did affect how people connected to community groups and to each other. But when it came to local news, there were outlets that people spectrum.
Hey, Andrea?
Yeah.
There's some folks in the chat who are having a hard time hearing you. I don't know if something's close to your mic, but there's something.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Maybe I had like something. Oh, sorry. Thank you. And forgive me, I'm not very good at looking at the chat and talking apparently, so please continue to let me know if something like that happens. Thank you. So we did this study, and this is sort of a summary of what we found, and we decided to circle back with community members to share what we found. And so we did a workshop where we brought together community members, journalists, and groups that work on engaged journalism and solutions journalism. And we got their input on what they wanted to do to follow up. One of the projects that came out of this was working with a hyper-local news outlet called the OC Monitor. This is Dustin and Lee Bratcher. They are the OC Monitor. They are the reporters, the editors, the owners, everything. And several of the ideas that came from this workshop that we did were thinking about how to take what we already have in this community, the assets we have, the community traditions we have, and to reimagine them. So in this case, it was looking at this very pre-Facebook idea of society columnists where people would share, here's the story of, here's what's going on in my community, but looking at trying to reimagine it as community contributors so that they could reach parts of the county that they couldn't reach otherwise. And then the other idea that they looked at was this, they call liars tables, and that's their term, not mine. If you go to this part of Western Kentucky and a lot of convenience stores in the morning, you might find a group of older gentlemen having coffee and, as they would say, solving the world's problems. And this is mostly coal miners, farmers, retirees, and it's how they get information about their community. And so the OC Monitor would go around to these different places and try to understand how can we take the information that's circulating here and connect it to our readers. And so we documented the process that they did piloting these initiatives and then trying to connect them with possible resources to follow up. So in that case, we did a community-centered process. We did a study of their needs and assets. We brought them together to design a project, and then we tried to pilot it and monitor it. But this is not a scalable project, and that's okay. It would make no sense for us to do liar's table tours in neighborhoods in Philadelphia, or, we wanted to understand though, is this, these are not scalable projects, but is the process itself portable? And so that's what I tried to do by working with people in the Philadelphia metro area to try out this process there. So in Germantown, it's a majority African-American neighborhood in Philly, and Montgomery County, majority white suburb in the region. And we did a study with residents in both locations where we looked at their relationship with local news and their needs and assets. And in Germantown, there was a sense that coverage was disproportionately negative and focused on crime. Meanwhile, in Montgomery County, the issues were more about the absence of local news. And so we held workshops in both locations, in Montgomery County and in Germantown, to talk about the findings and get recommendations from people about what to do next. And I'll just share real briefly what we ended up doing in the Germantown neighborhood, where community members shared ideas that led to the creation of something called the Germantown Info Hub, a project that's still going on now. And it has two main goals. So one is to try to improve how information circulates at the hyperlocal level. And the other is trying to improve how the community is represented by strengthening relationships between the community and media. And it does this by working with an advisory group of community members, a staff which has a community organizer and a reporter. And then we also have occasional classes where students and community members co-report stories and work with media partners and researchers. So before COVID, face-to-face outreach was one of our core activities. We also send out weekly text announcements, and we have a website. One of the most successful elements of this project has been doing monthly community discussions on issues that residents nominate. So ranging from gun violence to trash to discussions about redevelopment. And we also have accountability conversations where we invite local journalists to come and talk about the reporting that they've done in the neighborhood. So this project is ongoing, and it's something that I continue to work with colleagues on and try to monitor it. It's had some success so far, but even so, again, our argument's not to clone a bunch of Germantown info hubs. Even in Philadelphia, it wouldn't make sense in other neighborhoods. Each neighborhood has different needs and assets, and so they deserve a different kind of community-centered project. But transposing this process model from Kentucky to Philly allows us to understand that this process can be portable. And just a refresher of what that process is. So we assess the community's information needs. We try to bring people together to talk about those needs and have a convening to discuss them and brainstorm. Then we circle back with them and work out what is the intervention, and then we pilot it and monitor it. And so to wrap up this book, I tried to put the cases that I explored here into the larger context of engaged journalism and solutions journalism. So I talked to leaders of the different initiatives on the screen here, some of whom we're going to hear from in just a moment. And I argued that for engaged journalism and solutions journalism to strengthen ties between local storytelling networks, new roles and skills are needed. So most of these projects challenge traditional journalism norms and assumptions in different ways. So they use skills like facilitation or community organizing practices. And I'll let Alicia and Jessica and Sarah talk more about this. But I think these projects illustrate some of the different pathways to doing journalism that's community-centered. So based on the cases that I explore in this book, I tried to conclude with some recommendations for practitioners. And so in brief, these are, look for opportunities to combine engaged and solutions journalism. Try to let go of your expectations that the newsrooms always have to be in control. It always has to be on their terms. Build relationships with different kinds of community stakeholders and consider community organizations as well. Establish feedback and accountability loops, and question norms of detached objectivity as they've historically privileged whiteness and authority. Also, finally, for funders, consider community-led grant making if possible, and considering the funding of processes as well as projects. So of course I did all this pre-pandemic. And so, many of the community-centered journalism interventions I wrote about have face-to-face interaction at their core. So what does this work look like now? It's, a lot of what you're seeing here. But there are ways these different initiatives are trying to adapt. And I think all the people on this call are doing that. The Germantown Info Hub project, this is an example from them. We did a series of online focus groups to assess information needs during when the pandemic started. And then we, based on that, did a town hall discussion where we brought together community groups that wanted to share what they were doing on their COVID responses because they felt they weren't connecting. So as long as the needs and assets of communities are centered, even if we can't be face-to-face, there are strategies to adapt things. And so that's the the spiel. I don't think I made 10 minutes, but hopefully it wasn't too long of the book. I'm looking forward to people reading it and possibly rereading it myself. But I'm really looking forward to talking about it more once we get started in our at any point. But I want to get into our great panel of people we have here now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Hopefully that worked. And don't forget, you can put in questions into the Q&A function, and we'll try to answer those there about anything that I've just shared, but also about our panel. And also, please, thank you for those of you who've shared things into the chat. We will take a look at that. And also, if you have links or resources you want people to see, feel free to put them there. So thanks for doing that. So I want to go ahead and introduce or get back to our panelists. We did a quick introduction before. I want to start out actually, we're going to hear one by one from everyone a little bit more about their projects, and then we're going to have an opportunity to discuss them and hear and have questions from you. I'd like us to actually go ahead and start out with Jessica Maria Ross, who's the only person who's working out of a traditional newsroom on this call. So I'm very curious to hear from her, talk about her work at Capital Public Radio in Sacramento and how she's been trying to center communities through what she's been focusing on, participatory journalism. So Jessica, I'm going to pass it off to you. And you're muted.
Okay, there's the unmute. Here's the share. And let me get this going. And let me make sure I get my notes for myself. All right. First of all, I want to thank Andrea for all of that work. As someone who works in a newsroom, having people outside the newsroom really feed back theory, case studies, helps make the case for how to do this kind of community-centered journalism inside a news. And I'll be on this panel with these amazing women who inspire me all the time. What was really interesting to me listening to Andrea is that part of what I'm trying to do is ways to make the work scalable and replicable as opposed to portable. That that's a challenge inside a newsroom.
Hey, Jessica, just to let you know, because you guys let me know, we're seeing your notes, not the
Oh,
presentation.
you are.
Yeah, after at the beginning, we're so excited about it.
So funny. I wasn't even on script, so you guys got to read what I wasn't even thinking, what I wasn't even talking about. Let me try that one more time. How about this? And it's funny how that worked when we tried. Let's
Yeah, it
see.
worked perfectly before. Now we see like your slides, but your notes are kind of on the side on top of, up there now it's good. Now it's good.
Well, you know what? Let me try and just get back to this.
It looks good. You're good. Thank you. Sorry.
No, now you can see my notes.
Now it's fine.
Now it's fine?
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm really confused. Let me just check one more time. Are you seeing my full screen and the notes?
We see the notes kind of on top of the full screen.
All right.
Now it's the full screen. Now it's, yeah.
Well, you know what I'm going to do? I am just going to move a few things and, whoa, and ad lib, because that's the way this is going to have to work. All right. So I work at Cap Radio. I'm based in Sacramento, California's capital, and we serve about 13 counties in the Great Central Valley, which is a wide agricultural region that supplies the fruits and vegetables for most of actually the entire. And that's where most of my family is from. We're farmers. We work in the ag industry. And when we got together pre-COVID, and I would be talking about what I do, they would always be a bit puzzled because they've never heard of National Public Radio, let alone Cap Radio, even though they're right in the middle of our coverage area. And when I would talk about my work, they would, our public service journalism, they would ask me questions like, well, are you covering the economic crisis facing our family farms, or investigating zoning variances that developers are getting that are putting our operations at risk? How are you explaining field worker shortages or changes in irrigation district policies, or what's happening with pesticides? And I had to admit that in the 7 years that I've been at Cap Radio, I hadn't heard any of these stories covered. I hadn't heard kind of these voices of my rural farm family on air. And I don't think that's because our reporters and editors aren't interested in their perspectives or the bigger economic and political shifts that are facing people like my family. I think it's because our newsroom structure makes it really difficult to report on the range of voices and topics and to tell stories from this ground level in this huge region that we serve and that most public radio newsrooms serve. And by structure, I mean two things. Oh, whoa, what in the world? I am so sorry. I have no idea what just happened. 1 second. Oh my goodness, this is so
I blame
hard.
the fire.
Yeah, the fire is bad, but wow. This is really a challenge. So I'm very sorry, folks, but I'll keep talking and get back to this slideshow. And what I want to talk about newsroom structure is that our newsrooms, probably like yours, are incredibly, let me get one more share here. All right, let me try that. Our reporters are incredibly busy. They're producing spots, features, and talk show segments daily. And they're not just doing that on one platform, but many: broadcast, web, social media accounts. And it's a really heavy lift in a short amount of time. And really easy in this structure to, cover stories and issues that are coming to you. Much harder to really take a step back and look at what's missing, or even more farther back stepping to look at what are the information needs of the different communities we're serving. And the other thing in terms of our structure, until recently, newsroom mirrored our core audience. And in public radio, that looks a lot like me, right? White, college educated, urban, financially well off. So we weren't even bringing a diversity of lived experiences into our editorial decision making. And what I've discovered in this process, here we go. What I've discovered in this process is this. Newsrooms are workhorses. They are pumping out stories into this churning workflow that is routinized and habitual. And like any habit, that workflow is hard to change. But all we've learned in the pandemic, we can
I think Jessica's frozen. Maybe, oh, I'm so sorry, Jessica. I think if we can't, do you want to try to stop sharing your screen or okay, I think maybe we can come back to Jessica. Sorry about that. Alicia, would you be up for jumping in? Although I don't know if we're going to be able to. Oh, there we go. All right, Jessica, are you now I can hear you. Now I can see you moving. Did you want to try again one more time?
One more time, and maybe I should let people know that I'm 20 minutes from one of the big fires. So just a lot of challenges here. But I also don't want to take up a lot more time since I've had to jump around. Let me step back and just say that I'm not sure if you heard this, but basically what I'm thinking a lot about is that our structure in our newsroom has a lot of routine and habits, and those habits are what we really need to change. And the ways I'm trying to change those habits are to start off by really looking at, before we start reporting, getting to know the communities that we serve. And that's usually through in-person and virtual get-togethers. We can get to know them and listen and learn. It also can be through a whole lot of other tools that you have talked about. What's most important is showing up more than once over time so that we can really connect with people in ways and in places and on platforms and at times where they feel comfortable, welcome, and invited. And this is really what's going to help us select and develop stories in conversation with the communities that are most affected. As part of getting to know them, we really want to ask community members what's working, what they love about the place they live, what they want to put on the front page, as well as their concerns. And we ask about homegrown responses to the issues that they have identified and what kind of local solutions and resources that they are coming up with. And that really helps us build understanding, connection, and trust, not just between reporters and residents, but among residents and the community groups that are working to serve them. We also really, I try and form project advisory groups that are going to partner with us on our reporting. And as part of that work, we really explore how our reporting can help reach their goals and collaborate on community storytelling projects. And this gets to, again, some of the things Andrea was talking about collective efficacy. It strengthens the existing networks so that our journalistic process really contributes to building community resilience beyond our reporting. We do then take all of the ideas that we're hearing, the community needs, the community knowledge, the advisory group goals, and we bring them directly into our editorial process. That's where the heart of sharing power is in terms of reporting with and for the community that we have just gotten to know and are working to serve. And then we take time to talk with them after the project, them being participants in the project, community partners, editors, reporters, because every project gives us an opportunity to learn, to really identify and bump up against new challenges, rub up against different tensions inside the newsroom in terms of changing these habits and identify ways to do it better in the future. So there's a lot of different terms out here for this work. I'm calling it participatory journalism. Those 5 steps into a playbook, and I've shared the link here on a slide. I'll put it into the chat. There's how you can get a hold of me. An illustrated case study of this work is in Andrea's book, so I'll plug that, and also in this playbook. And I really, again, look forward to being in conversation with all of you about how to do this through the 1,000+ public radio newsrooms in this country, so that we can really listen, learn, and co-create stories with the communities we serve to create more community resilience. Thanks.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you for powering through in the circumstances, especially. So I really appreciate that. Alicia, it'd be great if you can share next. Alicia Bell from Free Press News Voices.
Hey y'all. As Andrea mentioned, my name's Alicia. I'm here based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm going to be talking about our News Voices work in Charlotte, North Carolina today. But I want to start with this quote that I'm grounding in, especially as I was working on these slides for this. It says, it's from the Mandate for Black People in this time from Mary Hooks in Atlanta, Georgia. And they say, the mandate for Black people in this time is to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, to earn the respect of future generations, and be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. They certainly did not say that in regards to journalism or transforming the future of journalism. But as I've been doing this work around the intersections between organizing and journalism and community-based journalism, that last part especially, to be willing to be transformed in the service of this work, comes up so frequently. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what our work has been here in North Carolina, but also the transformation of it. So the way that we describe News Voices, the project I work on right now, is that we organize with journalists and non-journalists to transform power dynamics within journalism. And we create processes that use organizing to co-create collaborative, equitable, and community-centered journalism. I say that's what we use now to describe it because it's certainly not what we've always used. In fact, what we used to say is that we seek to build power with communities so residents have a stronger voice in how local journalism can be revived, strengthened, and transformed. The text of those things is only slightly different, but I think a key difference there is that we are no longer doing this work so that with the focus that communities are only supporting journalism. We are doing this work in a way that makes sure that there is an equitable relationship that is more holistically focused on information equity and information needs, and thinking about the different roles that communities play in the journalism of a place, in the journalism of a space. And so the way that we describe this work now and the way that we do this work now is different than the way it used to be. So when I talk about the overlaps between organizing and journalism, this is a little bit of what I'm talking about, where we move from organizing as a process and a science of sorts, moves from relationship building to political education, to strategizing, to action, to learning and evaluation. And so the way that we see that happening within community-based journalism and within the work that we're doing is that the relationship building is pretty clear cut. That is a thing that happens. Political education sometimes looks like what people call media literacy or newsroom literacy or community literacy, because oftentimes newsrooms need community literacy in order to do good journalism, and it's not always as much of a focus as like media literacy. And when we're thinking media literacy and newsroom literacy, we're thinking more about like what is the structure and function of a newsroom or a newsroom ecosystem, more so than like how do you read the news, because we found that a lot of media literacy can be really paternalizing and condescending, and that's not how we want to build power in the communities that we're working in. So from there we go to strategizing and visioning, taking action, and I think the action in this community-based journalism is the community-based journalism, like that's the mobilization. The mobilization is the work that we do together, and then we learn and evaluate throughout that. So what that's looked like in North Carolina, it's been dream salons, community conversations, trainings, ecosystem mapping, supporting engagement strategies, capacity building with local projects, co-creating newsletters, all kinds of different things. So there's all kinds of tactics you can take, and I really appreciated what Andrea was saying earlier, that the projects and the tactics are not necessarily scalable, but the process is portable. Because the process that I just talked about is the same process we use all the time, but the action is different. And the action really depends on what a community's needs are. I think in doing this work though, there's 3 lessons and 3 kind of takeaways that I wanted to share here today, which one is vision early. When we first started doing this work, we started off with ecosystem mapping and community conversations around information needs. And that was really important work. And we didn't create a collective vision on what folks wanted or needed for the future of journalism to be. And that's something that's shifted in this work and something that we continue to incorporate. Because doing that, moving into the community conversations and the ecosystem mapping without visioning and without dreaming meant that we were in some ways gatekeeping what the future of journalism could be for a place. And so in seeking not to be a gatekeeper, knowing that communities have all the answers that we need, and individual communities have all the answers that they need, we knew it was important to vision early, to make sure that we were creating collective vision and then moving tactics and moving strategies that were in alignment with that vision. To make sure also that what the newsrooms are seeking to do and what the community organizations are seeking to do are moving towards aligned and similar goals and not just based on what that individual organization wants or needs or thinks is profitable. The second part is that building local organizing infrastructure supports good journalism. And I know this might sound like wild talk to folks who are like organizing and journalism are completely separate spaces, but especially in regards to COVID and the coronavirus response, this is where we saw this be the most important. When we were employing strategies to find out people's information needs in the early days of quarantines and the coronavirus, we were using phone trees and texting and emails to reach people, right? We were using phone trees and texting because not everybody has access to the internet because of the digital divide. Where this worked best is where we were able to partner with organizations that had phone banks or phone trees that they were already using to check in with their members. It worked best where there was already organizing infrastructure that we were able to collaborate with, and it worked best where there were strong funding in places to be able to compensate captains to text people or to do the phone banking or the phone treeing. Where that did not exist, the work of meeting information needs at a variety of levels was not as strong. And so a lot of times we talk about how strong communities create strong infrastructure. And this is one example of that if folks in a community are not supported and there is not capacity for strong organizing, it's much more difficult to spiral out into that community and figure out the long line of storytelling needs and information needs. And the third thing I wanted to share that we've been learning and that we really incorporate into our work now is to move from input to collaboration as quickly as trust allows. I don't say as quickly as possible because it's not going to work, it's not going to be sustainable, and it's not going to be what a community needs. I really appreciate this chart from the Movement Strategy Center. This is also not specific to journalism, it's specific to community infrastructure. And I believe that journalism is a community infrastructure at its best. Certainly not all the time. Not all the journalism is community needed, but at its best, that is what journalism should be. And so I think when we're doing this work, and a lot of times the newsrooms we're working with and the places we're working with are really at a 0 or a 1. There's no community involvement or there's like some informing that's happening. When we bring in engagement and we bring in community building, community relationship building, that usually takes it to maybe a 2. I think the best engaged journalism moves it from a 2 to a 3 maybe. But There's very few places. I can definitely probably count on one hand, maybe two hands, where we see collaboration and community ownership of newsrooms. And I really want to lift up a quote from Fraser Nelson at the Salt Lake City Tribune last week, who works as their vice president of business strategy, and said that the only way we're ever going to be financially successful and financially sustainable is if we're woven into the fabric of our community. And so thinking about engagement and solutions journalism moving into the future of journalism means that our journalism has to be sustainable. And if our journalism can only be sustainable if it's woven and necessary in the fabric of our community, then this is how we get to a sustainable journalism in the future. And so that's what I'll end with. Definitely going to be in the chat answering questions. This is my contact information. I know Andrea is going to share it in the chat and other places. But that's what I've got for folks today.
Thank you, Alicia. That was great. That's wonderful. Let's next hear from Sarah from Outlier Media in Detroit, how she's been providing direct service to residents in Detroit. I'll let you take it away.
Hey y'all, it's good to see everybody and well, see these folks and then see everybody's name in the chat. And I know it's really challenging times for everybody too. So I just want to kind of recognize that we're all carrying a lot right now. So that's really funny that Alicia just shared that slide, because I used to work with Movement Strategy Center like way back in the day before I was a reporter. And I think that, yeah, like a lot of that thinking and brilliance from that organization really does inform the way that I work. So I just want to say, so I'm the founder and editor of Outlier Media. Andrea, when you interviewed me for this book, I think Outlier was me only. And now it's a full news organization, a full newsroom. And Candace Fortman also runs the business side of the operation. But really, we haven't changed much. And just like Andrea was saying about scale, that's not something that I really believe is possible in this type of work. Replication is possible, learning, models, and even though we've gotten bigger, we've continued to use the very same methodology because it works for a smaller organization or for a larger organization. I saw folks in the chat asking about like, how do national organizations kind of use these lessons? I think the methodology may be slightly different depending on who you're working with and for, but like you should have some methodology, right? And methodology for local news organizations works as well. So my goal in journalism is to be effective, to be efficient, and to be responsive. The way that we do that is to first kind of look at our role in the ecosystem, the journalistic ecosystem. And again, really understanding that there are community organizations that have their specific role and we're existing in community with them. We don't do their job, they don't do our job, but we really want to make sure that we understand like what's happening. From the information ecosystem, community organizations play a huge role. Journalistic organizations play a huge role. And for us, we are in the business of accountability journalism and in the business of filling information gaps. There's also folks who really seek to provide a complete and accurate record. There are also folks who try to correct an inaccurate record. And there are folks who work on narrative shift, right? Like those are kind of the parts of the journalistic ecosystem that you have to be a healthy media ecosystem, right? Post-COVID, Outlier is doing most of these things. Once, I hope that our community is able to become more healthy again and we can focus on filling information gaps and accountability. So just like everybody, the reason why we are so careful about the way that we do this work is because our resources are incredibly scarce. Journalistic resources are incredibly scarce and our resources in our newsroom are incredibly scarce. Like I was saying, it used to be just me. Now we have, 4 folks on the editorial side, but we're doing a ton for a very large city. And the stakes are also incredibly high. I very much look at journalism as an intervention. And so that means that, like, why are you intervening? We're intervening either to fill information gaps because a harm will result. Because if there's a lack of information, it's going to lead to a harm. And we really look at what we're doing and which information gaps we want to fill based on how acute that harm could be or is going to be. So for example, post-COVID, we've had to do a lot of reporting on the corrections industry and on jails and prisons in Michigan because the harm is incredibly serious for COVID breaking out in places like that. So that's what we do. And also because the journalists, like, no one's coming to fix this. So, you know, to get something wrong means that you have a huge risk of misinformation, and those stakes are also incredibly high. And like I said, you know, there's a lot of people who have to do narrative shift work and record correction work because somebody got it wrong the first time. And like, when you know how many resources it takes to do any of this work, you really don't want to have to go and fix somebody else's work because it wasn't done well the first time around. We're super data-driven in the way that we approach information needs. And we've done this work with Jesikah in Stockton, and we've done this work in a lot of different communities. But what we look for to try to identify information gaps is we look at a lot of publicly available data. We look at United Way's 211 data of, like, what are people calling and complaining about most? We look at response times across the city for a variety of different things. And it really tells you a lot. Like, you know, you can look at potholes, you can look at non-emergency 911 calls, you can look at emergency 911 calls. Response time across the city for all of those different things is really going to tell you a lot about how responsive the you know, kind of municipality is to different people's needs. So we look at all of these things, and then we also ask people what challenges they're facing, and we do that over SMS, and it's a very easy info needs survey. And what we're trying to do is not ask people, like, what do you want to know? What news do you like? We're asking them, like, what challenges are you facing this week? What do you see standing in the way of your family thriving over the next few months? And that's kind of how we start to build our work. I'm going to put some links in the chat right after I finish talking. I thought I was better at multitasking than I am, but I'm going to put those in a minute. But you may have seen some work from a collaboration of us, and it was published by City Bureau, called "Is Your Journalism a Luxury or a Necessity?" And it really has this, like, pyramid. It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we adapted it because that's really how a lot of us are thinking about where do we want to target our work. And we want to target our work at the very bottom of that pyramid. Like, we want to make sure that people have the information that they need to survive, and then we're going to move up and see, like, you know, what do people need to thrive? And I'm of the, it's my belief, and this is not like, I think a lot of people don't believe this, but, like, I just think journalism needs to focus on the bottom of the pyramid. And then there's a lot of other things, cultural institutions, right? Like different literary magazines, like all these other things can, like, focus on the top of the pyramid, which is kind of at the very top is like cocktail party, right? Like, what do you want to talk about? What do you want to think about? All this stuff, right? But let's just get the bottom of the pyramid right. And then let's let other folks worry about that, since journalism is such a scarce resource. So that's kind of like how we are trying to target our work. And we do distribute it over text message because it's the easiest way to get to people in Detroit. We have an incredibly stark digital divide in Detroit. The majority of people do not have computers at home or access to Wi-Fi. A lot of people don't have data plans that would allow them to access a news app. So we use our work over SMS. We've been doing that for several years. We are still doing it. Sorry, my calendar. We're still doing it, and we'll change when people want to get their information a different way. But we always ask people, and TV and SMS is the way that people would like to get their information. So we deliver information to folks through this SMS system. It's really complicated. Everybody can do it. This I could like do while I was sleeping. So text the word Detroit to 73224, and you can check out our system. oops, I just sent that to Alicia. I meant to send it to everybody. You can check out how the system works, and you'll see that there's like many ways to say, someone follow up with me. It's something else. I have a different problem, right? Like we're always asking people that, and then people are getting back to us and telling us what it is, that what their challenge is. And that's where a lot of our investigative work comes from. People who's like, we can't predict what their information need is because there's a systemic breakdown. So I will kind of also link to the work that we've done, all of the watchdog and investigative work that we've done. We have another new big investigation coming out tomorrow. And that's why, like, this is I designed it as a news wire for low-income news consumers, because those are the people that I want to serve. That's who I'm accountable to. But it's also like the most efficient way to create investigative journalism that's really going to address harm at a community level and hopefully create accountability. So that's the way we do it. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm so happy to be in community with all of these folks on this panel and all of you who are participants here and always willing to answer questions. And I'm going to drop all the rest of the stuff that I wanted to talk about into the chat right now.
Thank you, Sarah. And there's a question in there that you might want to drop in. I think you're using the Reach platform for SMS. Someone was asking about the what platform you're using for SMS.
Yeah, we do. We use the Reach platform, and I will say, like, it's really, and we've had a lot of success with that platform, but it is still really frustrating that, like, because it's not sexy SMS, it's just like seen as really basic. And so the technology that we're always having to work with, like, has to be customized again and again and again. And we see like new technology solutions being designed for folks who don't really need them, and technology solutions for folks who really do need better solutions. Like there's just like such little investment. So I'm just gonna put my frustration there.
Hopefully there will be more. I think there from the people on this call. I thank you all so much. And I know our time is a little short. I think I'm going to say right now, we're going to go 5 minutes over. If anybody needs to leave, I totally understand why. But I want to do our best to get to some of the questions people have had. I have some questions. I'm not going to get to ask all of them, but I'll ask one that is, I think, connecting to several of the questions that we've gotten so far. A number of people have asked about objectivity and about how to communicate, how you think about objectivity and independence. And one of the things that several of you mentioned was working with community organizations in different ways. And I think that that's something that often I've heard journalists react a little allergically to working with community organizations because of concerns about objectivity. And so I'm wondering if any of you want to jump in on how you grapple with questions around objectivity, how objectivity can be problematic, and how you kind of think about the working with community organizations.
Yeah, I just dropped a little bit about this in response. I think there was a person named Yanis who asked the question about objectivity in community partners. And just building off of that, I think I don't think that is a real dichotomy that has to exist. And I think that grounding has to be in the like difficult truth, which is that we are all socialized under like systems of oppression and things like patriarchy and white supremacy and capitalism and all those things, right? There's a lot of things that build our culture and we all grow up learning them. So actually the being in community and being amongst people who are specific to a place or a space or an identity helps break that bias that we've learned. And so I think a lot of attempts at objectivity that leave out community voice, community partnership, or community perspective end up being misinformation and biased because they omit the full truth. And so I tell folks this all the time. Growing up, my mama always told me that a failure to tell the whole truth is also a lie. And when newsrooms aren't partnering with communities and aren't aren't bringing in community questions or narrative or story, then there's an omission of truth that happens. And that is a form of misinformation. And it also then contributes to why those communities don't trust that newsroom. And so I think that dichotomy between things doesn't have to be real, and in fact reinforces more siloing and more division between communities that our journalism is supposed to be for and with.
I wanted to ask, this touches on, one person asked about national reporters. What advice do you have for journalists in more traditional newsrooms, whether they be local or national, who want to do this kind of community-centered work? Like, what advice do you have for them, whether they be a junior person or a more senior person? Maybe Jessica, you want to jump in there.
I think the 3 pieces of advice I would share is to start small is the first one, and the second is to find allies in the newsroom that are already doing this work or already interested, and allies outside the newsroom that are already doing this work and already interested. As Alicia kind of has mentioned, there's just a rich tradition in organizing, in the arts, in city government, in design, in architecture. Participatory practices are something that all public-facing institutions and organizations have been trying for a very long time and have a lot of understanding and practice of how to do that. So to start small, find people inside and outside the newsroom that want to join you on the journey. And then the last thing is to really, I'll go back to something that Alicia said, vision early. So part of visioning early for me means bringing those people together to come up with shared language, shared understanding, and shared vision. Takes a while, longer than you think, but those are the 3 things that I could do.
Thank you, Jessica. Someone just asked about student journalists and adapting these practices for student journalists. And I actually was wondering, I wanted to ask all of you, if you could reinvent journalism school to cover the competencies that you use on a day-to-day basis that probably aren't being taught in journalism school, what would those be? What are the things that you wish they would be teaching? Anybody can jump in on this.
I'll jump in and hand it over. I think a core competency is actually facilitation training. I think one of the pieces that is invisible and opaque in this is that it's really, really anchored in group process and group dynamics. And one of the fields that really teaches about navigating, understanding, recognizing, and practicing equitable power sharing and listening and shared decision making is the realm of facilitation. And I use facilitation because people are less allergic to that than organizing. All of that is true for community organizing as well.
Would there be a community organizing component as well, Alicia?
I mean, I agree with Jessica. I think it's the same thing. It's like facilitation. I mean, organizing is facilitation at a community level. It's like you listen to people, there's some ground rules and understandings, and then you co-create something together. So I agree that it's the same thing. I think a competency I would want to develop is relationship building. We don't all know how to do that well. And sometimes that's because of personal, interpersonal trauma experiences. Maybe we grew up and we moved around a lot. Maybe we never learned by observation how to build relationships that are strong, healthy relationships. And so it makes sense that in our work that we wouldn't know how to build those relationships and have boundaries and figure out like what are the different roles that we play in this relationship, especially knowing that like there are different levels of relationships. There are personal relationships, professional relationships. Some of the skills are the same between those two spaces, but the way that they function and work are different. So honestly, I think just like a good grip of time focusing and practicing relationship building would be so key. Plus it would have all these other benefits of like navigating J schools and colleges and universities and the world, because we need each other in all those spaces too.
Sarah, did you want to add anything for your wish list?
I didn't go to journalism school, but I went to law school, which is really different, I think. But I will say that one thing that I feel like when I became a journalist, that I was very frustrated by was just like how few things were actually like articulated and codified, which is something that you do see in law. For like, you know what you're doing as a lawyer, right? Like, you're client-centered, you know what the ethics are. Nobody's going to tell you like, let me talk about it some more. Like, let's talk about it, but it's all written down, right? Like, it's I think that there is a lot of gatekeeping in journalism because things are so unspecified, and that's one thing that you can do to make your work more accessible, is to make it more clear what you're doing and what you're not doing. And that's something that, like, I think that keeps those barriers to entry into journalism pretty high, because it's like all of this stuff is unsaid and you just have to kind of know it, right? And that's that does a huge disservice for the industry and also for the communities that the industry tries to serve.
I wanted just to, and we're pretty much out of time, and there's so many questions, great questions from people that we're not going to be able to get to, but do you have advice for community members who want to improve access to information in their communities, or people who are maybe not on the inside of journalism? Anybody want to share any of those?
Make your demands, right? Like, make your demands to the people who, even if you don't expect a newsroom to be responsive to those information needs, I still think that it's incredibly valuable that those get written down and that you create a record for saying, like, we asked you to do this, we said this was what we needed, and you did not respond, right? Like that, news organizations need to really be held accountable to the community's information needs. And if they're not going to do it themselves, then and I think everybody else on this call, like, would really encourage people to really try to hold.
Yeah, I would just add to that to name and honor and hold the ways that you're already meeting information needs. So many institutions outside of a newsroom meet the information and storytelling needs of our communities, whether that is a community center, an arts institution, like a local grassroots organization. And so I think naming and honoring those things, and then figuring out where the gaps are, how you want to build those, and what that collaboration looks like, really I think works well with the having demands on local newsrooms and the local news ecosystem, because if we're pushing pre-existing organizations at the same time that we're building alternatives, then we're going to get to a better place.
I think I would just also add that now is the time, that the pandemic has just blown the doors open for us to really rethink, reimagine how we do our work, who and see in the data, literally, who it's serving and who it's not, and bring in new ways of figuring out together with the people we're trying to get this critical information to, how we do that. So when I used to talk about this, 6 months ago, it was really about using our radical imagination. And I don't think we have to use that now. I think we can envision and go very quickly. So I want to just put that out there.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we could probably continue this conversation another hour and not run out of questions and things to discuss, but unfortunately we can't. Also, I want to give a plug to Alicia's Media 2070 project, which I think is also the perfect moment to look into that. Just Google that, check it out, looking at the harms that journalism has caused. But there's lots of resources about all of these projects. You can see some of them in the chat. We also I'll probably be doing some more conversations about this book. There's more information about all of these projects in the book. I'll also be doing these engaged journalism exchange discussions every once in a while, where we're going to bring folks in occasionally for that. So I'm sorry we can't see all of you. Somebody actually pinged us for that, and like I was hoping we could, but it's just that we had for certain reasons for this particular webinar, we couldn't do the thing where we see everybody, but I'm glad to know that you're out there, and I hope we can find other ways of finding community in the future. I want to really thank all of the panelists for joining us today, and all of you. And I hope we can find ways to talk again in the future, and to learn from each other. So thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you soon.